Chapter 5, Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. The sun had long set. To the west over the Pacific, the sky was still faintly blue, clinging to the memory of day. Brent moved to a seat across the aisle so to scan to the darker eastern sky, wading through a long stretch of trees, and then thought he spotted it, Deneb, in the constellation Cygnus, the swan. He squinted at his book and then out the bus window. Now that they were out of Los Angeles, the air was much clearer. He looked again and was amazed to make out the shape of a cross with Deneb at its head, just as in the book. He grinned in the darkness, unknown to those around him. He spoke the word Deneb in his mind and felt himself to be Adam, naming the new world around him. He took his flashlight from his pack and read on. He'd bought the book in a store he passed in San Francisco using the Visa card his parents had gotten him. He'd also bought 6 blades for a saw, more sandpaper, and a San Francisco map, and had used the card to get more cash. He planned on building the whirligig there, but after a day of freezing in the fog and a night in a cheap hotel, unable to sleep for all the shouting and footsteps, he climbed back onto the bus that morning, heading south to San Diego. This would put the whirligig closer to the corner of the country and would put him in a warmer climate. He hadn't brought anything long-sleeved. He hadn't mentioned this oversight or any others when he called his parents from the bus station in L.A. They were dubious enough about the trip as it was. Just as in the first call he'd made, they'd barraged him with questions, reminders, and cautions. He'd half insisted, curiously, fingering his blonde hair. He'd forgotten to bring shampoo, and he'd washed it with soap, leaving it stiff as cardboard. Setting out by eye from Deneb, he found Vega, then Altier. He hadn't realized before the individual stars had names. The book called these 3 the Summer Triangle. He stared at Vega, the brightness bluish-white, and felt it stare back at him. They held the gaze like tango dancers, while the woman behind him snored obliviously. The trio of stars shone for him alone. By now, he was accustomed to feeling separate from the other passengers. For them, the bus was an interlude. For him, it was home. No other existence outside of travel awaited him. It was all as familiar to him as if he'd been riding for years. The scent of the bathroom, the menu at the meal stops, the inevitable drinker far to the rear, the old woman in the first row who asked their driver to confirm that she was on the right bus every 10 miles. It was an anonymous community, just right for him. But unlike the others, when he stepped off the bus, he'd remain in a world of nameless strangers. He looked out, except that he now knew Deneb and Vega and Altier. It was 10 when the bus stopped in San Diego. His joints creaking, Brent clumped down the steps. The passengers gathered their luggage beside the bus and then scattered. Their community disbanded. He alone remained outside, leaning his pack against a wall and fishing through his pockets for the paper. A young woman from Holland who'd gotten off in Santa Barbara had told him about youth hostels and had let him copy an address from her book. After the night in the San Francisco flophouse, he was ready for a change, though not ready to use his visa to stay somewhere like the Sheraton, as his parents had begged him. The trip was his to take, not theirs. The hostel was cheap, friendly, filled with students, sounded more interesting. "Excuse, please." Brent looked up. A short mustached man with a suitcase stood before him. In one hand, he held a tiny address book. "I wonder if you can tell me where this address in San Diego is. It's my brother's house." Brent knew he would be of no help, but when the man held the address book toward him, pointing to the bottom line with a pen, he instinctively stepped forward, bent over the book, studied the microscopic writing, and then caught a flash of movement and turned. Behind him, a scruffy teenager had a hand on his backpack. Brent stared at him, speechless. He saw the door he'd come through, and then he glanced back at the first man and realized that they were a team. Saw no one to appeal to except 2 drivers at the far end of the station, and yelled, "Leave me alone!" loudly enough that both drivers turned. The thieves exchanged a long look. The hand reluctantly released his pack, and then the pair skulked wordlessly into the night. It took 3 packages of potato chips before Brent's heart slowed to a normal speed. He was inside the station, squeezed onto a bench, surrounded by fellow travelers, and safe. It dawned on him why animals lived in herds. He scouted the room's perimeter for predators, decided against walking to the hostel, marched outside, and got a cab. Through its window, he saw the Summer Triangle following him and felt watched over. A cab parked. Brent hefted his pack from the trunk and stood on the sidewalk after the cab left. The night air was warm. A bird was singing somewhere. Beside him, he now saw, stood a palm tree. He sided up its long trunk, touched it, and felt he'd entered a different country. The impression was deepened when he walked up the steps and past the porch, where two women were sitting in wicker rockers and conversing in a language he couldn't place. Brent passed them and presented himself at the desk. "Passport or visa, please," said the clerk. He was young, with a pungent English accent and a head heaped with black curls. "Passport?" Brent was stunned. "I'm an American. We only take foreign travelers here," said the clerk, "the theory being, as I understand it, that this being your own country, you've already got yourself a place to stay." Brent sighed conspicuously, wondered what to do, glanced at a couple huddled over a map, and saw that the hostel was simply a large house that was standing in the corner of, and he was standing in the corner of the living room. "Of course, it being as late as it is and unlikely that anyone else will show up, and we being unusually empty as it happens, we might just convince me that you're Canadian." A smile flickered on the clerk's lips. Brent stared at him and slowly comprehended. "So what city is it that you're from?" the man asked. Brent racked his brain, then thought of the cyclist that he met at the campground in Washington. "Prince George," he answered. "Ah, what's Canada's capital?" Brent rummaged madly through his mind. In vain. "Ottawa, right you are," supplied the clerk. "And what year did England wrest control of your fair country from France?" Brent knew that fact was nowhere in his memory. 1763? "Right again," said the clerk. He handed Brent a pen and gestured grandly toward the register. "Welcome." He gave Brent a tour and showed him to the room he'd share with three other males. Floating up the stairs came the faint peeping of a concertina. Brent had glimpsed the player in the dining room, a bearded man, eyes closed, fingers punching out the melody on their own. After coming out of the bathroom, Brent stood listening to the cheery, reedy sound. He envied the man his power to entertain himself and others. There seemed no end to his stock of tunes. He thought back to the cyclist, admirably self-contained as well, not simply with his dome tent and gas lamp, but with his go game and his thick book on the subject. By comparison, his own life seemed unfurnished with skills and interest. He desired to become the man he was impersonating. He woke to find himself alone in the room. He smelled bacon. Like gravity, the scent pulled him irresistibly downstairs. The hostel served a free continental breakfast. Those who'd bought their own groceries were cooking more substantial fare in the kitchen. Cautiously, he entered the fray, nonchalantly poured some coffee, a drink he'd only tried once, grabbed a pastry, and took a seat. A minute later, a young man sat across from him and asked, "Hey, where are you from?" "Canada." Brent kept his voice low. He sipped his coffee, fought back a grimace, and reached for the sugar bowl. "What part?" "British Columbia," he mumbled, praying there were no Canadians present. He ate his sweet roll nervously. The lies were piling up now, and he was a coffee drinker. He was a Canadian, and most seriously that he was a mere tourist, not a convicted killer on a mission of repentance. Not only his every word, but his every bite and breath was counterfeit. Prison, where no pretense was needed, suddenly seemed to be a better choice. His table-mate was German, a year older, traveling before starting college in the fall. Brent was amazed that he had no accent. After 1 year of French and 3 years of Spanish, he could neither understand nor speak a sentence in either language. His companion mentioned that he just finished 2 years before the mast and would pass it on to him. Brent sensed from the boy's comments that he knew more about American history than Brent himself did. The boy was tall, with strawberry blonde hair. The two could be mistaken for each other at a distance. Brent studied him in a secret admiration, thinking he might easily have been born into his body instead, and might speak his 3 languages and know all that he knew. When the German asked if he wanted to see the sights downtown with him, Brent at once abandoned his plan to start the next whirligig. A half hour later, they were boarding a bus. The Pacific in the distance, the red tile roofs, the palm trees, the countless Mexican restaurants all made Brent feel gloriously distant from Chicago. Mexico was only 20 miles away, according to the German boy. He introduced himself as Emil. They got off the bus at Balboa Park, headed for the San Diego Zoo, and spent the rest of the morning strolling through mesas, rainforests, and aviaries. Emil would be studying biology at his university and provided a constant commentary on bird plumages and migration, European snakes, the evolution of the elephant. Fantasizing he was beholding his own double, Brent watched raptly when Emil made sketches and jotted notes. "I'm sorry if I'm talking too much," he said to Brent. "Both of my parents are teachers." "No problem." They would like me to become one as well. A teacher lives forever through his students. They are my father's favorite words. Brent suddenly thought back to Miss Gill, the mediator in Chicago, and her saying that the effects of an act traveled far beyond one's knowledge. He knew she'd meant harmful acts like this. He saw now that the same could be said of good deeds, such as teachers' years of inspiring. Everything we did, good, bad, indifferent, sent a wave rolling out of sight. He wondered what his own accounting generations later would look like. They ate lunch, watched a marimba duo, a sword swallower in Balboa Park, sampled the museums of photography and the model railroading, and then spent 2 hours in a natural history museum. Brent had never known anyone his age who went to museums voluntarily. He was strictly Emil's sidekick. Afterward, however, while exploring downtown, he asserted himself and abruptly entered a music store they were passing. He could still hear the concertina's merry burbling in his head. 10 minutes later, he walked out with a harmonica and an instruction book. He'd try his hand at making his own music. Dinner at the hostel was a boisterous affair, conducted in several languages. He and Emil bought some frozen enchiladas, which they heated in the kitchen's overburdened microwave. It seemed strange to Brent to see men carefully mincing garlic and sautéing vegetables. He was a stranger to the stove, nor did the dinner conversation at the table resemble anything heard in his house. Mixed in with descriptions of SeaWorld and the beach were long discussions of world affairs, sometimes in raised voices. Brent was surprised at how much the other guests both knew and cared. Politics had never come up at home. Brent listened unobtrusively as diners and topics came and went, and finally he slipped out himself. The concertina player was nowhere about. The house seemed much emptier without him. Brent observed travelers writing postcards, recalled that he'd bought some, and realized he had no one he wanted to send them to. He was a planet on which there was no other life as yet. And then he felt the harmonica in his pocket and thought to himself, "Let there be music." He chose the back lawn, more private than the rockers. On the front porch, he read the booklet's instruction. The instrument you hold is a full orchestra in miniature. Stared at the photo, marked figure 1A, snorted at the player's jacket and cufflinks, read 3 times the detailed instructions. Raise your harmonica. Now moisten your lips. Now fill your lungs. Then partially exhale. Set the instrument to his mouth and produced his first note. Congratulations! By the fading light, then by flashlight, he pored over lesson 1, trying to find C at the 4th hole without looking, tripping over the C scale's quirky pattern, laboring with scant success to get a single note instead of 2. He put it away. Discouraged, glaring at the words, "Play instantly," on the booklet. He turned off the flashlight, tilted his head, found the somber triangle, a familiar face to him now, and felt better. In the morning, he found a paperback copy of 2 Years Before the Mass by his bed with Emil's address written on the bookmark. He'd left very early, according to the clerk. Brent looked as though he were leaving as well, trapping out the front door with his pack on his back. After breakfast, feeling like a fraud, he walked 3 blocks, turned to the right, walked 4 more, and came to a park he'd glimpsed the day before. Here he could work on his whirligig undetected by other guests. He claimed a picnic table, laid out his tools like a surgeon, and flipped through his book. He made up his mind to vault ahead from the simplest style he'd built in Washington, and decided on the spouting whale operated by a propeller and rods. The book's previous owner had been there before him, leaving penciled annotations like footprints. The sight of them cheered Brent. He sketched the whale on wood, erased, revised, then realized that Leah wasn't in it. He considered giving the whale her face and then painting it in its belly as Jonah, and then looked through the book, saw a design with a mermaid, and decided to change its hair to black and transpose it to the top of the spout. He didn't know what had given him the nerve to try such an ambitious project. The sunny morning made anything seem possible. By dinner time, not even close to the half finished, he felt like a gasping marathon runner, wondering why he'd made himself do it. The whirligig ended up taking 3 days, spent in trying to balance the propeller blades, bending rods, threading rods, wasting wood, starting over, walking a mile and a half to a hardware store for supplies and advice. He learned the hard way to paint in the morning, so the surfaces would be dry by the time he packed up at the end of the day. He swore at the book and then at himself for making foolish mistakes. It was the harmonica that saved him. Playing it during the breaks and at night, improving a blowing through the single hole, progressing from hot cross buns to Tom Dooley to Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, he had drop by drop to his store of perseverance, which supplied both texts. Despite the difficulties, the whirligig was absorbing, blocking everything else from view. The characters from his first life, the allies, the enemies, the potential girlfriends who'd once loomed like giants were now barely visible. Distant figures disappearing over the horizon. He still noticed the cars he'd lusted after and heard snatches of songs linked to that era. His reactions felt distant and ghostly. He had no desire to revive that life. It had all been crumpled in the crash. He no longer gave any thought to his clothes. He was outcast, part of no group, and no longer had anyone to impress. Only when the wind blew did he feel watched by Leah, looking down on his work. It was late afternoon when he finished it. After testing it dozens of times, he looked down at the book instructions, took his pencil and wrote in the margin, "Added mermaid from page 87 on spout," followed by the date and his name. He felt he was conversing with the book's former owner. He now faced the problem of where to set it up. He didn't think it would last long in a public park in a big city. And then he remembered seeing a set of wind chimes on the hostel's porch. He made his way back and asked the clerk if he could offer it as a gift in thanks for being taken in. Sure, it'll bring a bit more life to the front, he viewed it, but no need to go buying presents. Brent mounted it then and there, trying out 3 different locations, making various minor adjustments. The wind that sprang up each afternoon was blowing, sending the whale spout up and down, with the mermaid on top like a bronc rider. No guest chanced to be out front. Brent snapped a photo and disappeared. When the subject of its origin came up at dinner, Brent was as silent as the others. Afterward, though, on the porch, he was not. He claimed one of the rockers, took out his harmonica, and began working on memorizing "My Bonnie Lies Over the Ocean." It had been sung briskly back in grammar school, the refrain cheery and rousing. He now saw it for the lament that it was. Leah lay across an ocean no boat could cross. He practiced the song over and over, scratching into his brain the pattern of which holes to draw on and which to blow. He finally got it down, closed the book, faced Leah, and played it through perfectly. Champagne bottles are broken on ship's bows. This felt like a whirligig christening. A couple sitting on the front lawn clapped. Early the next morning, Brent moved on.